The sun hung low and mean over the desert when Boone Wilder crested the rise overlooking Dead Mesa. His horse, a worn roan named Whiskey, moved slow, its hooves stirring up red dust that clung to Boone's boots and duster like bad memories. Dead Mesa wasn't much to look at. A crooked row of buildings stood like old teeth on either side of the main street, a saloon with broken shutters, a church that hadn't seen a preacher in years, a general store barely held together with rusted nails. The only thing that seemed alive was the wind, whispering secrets through dry brush and swinging the sign outside. The sheriff's office with a lazy creak. Boone reined in and lit a cigarette with a match struck on his belt buckle. He studied the town from beneath the shadow of his hat. The place didn't look like it had gold. It barely looked like it had hope. But maps don't lie, at least, not the one he carried folded in the lining of his coat. He nudged Whiskey forward. Heads turned as he passed. A boy by the well stopped cranking the handle, his eyes wide as saucers. An old woman sweeping her porch froze, broom midair. Most folks just watched from behind curtains, like ghosts afraid of the living. Boone tied. Off in front of the saloon, the only place that looked halfway open, he stepped down, dust clouding around his boots, and pushed open the swinging doors. Inside, the saloon was dim and quiet. A few men nursed drinks in silence, their faces weathered. Like canyon walls, the piano sat silent, one leg broken. The bartender, a wiry man with a silver mustache, nodded but said nothing. Boone ordered whiskey. No one spoke. No one asked questions. That was fine by him, but not everyone liked silence. The door swung open again, and the room tensed. A man stepped in, tall, iron-jawed, and wearing a tin star dulled by sun and age. Sheriff Clay Mathers. He didn't speak at first, just looked Boone over. Dusty coat, revolver on the hip. Stranger's eyes, the kind that have seen too much and trust too little. Name, the sheriff finally asked, his voice like gravel and burnt coffee. Boone Wilder, he said, without turning from his drink. That so? The sheriff said, stepping closer. Ain't seen you before. First time in Dead Mesa. Hope it's your last. Boone turned in, slow and steady. That how you greet all newcomers. Sheriff Mathers didn't flinch. Only the ones who ride in with trouble on their tail. Or gold in their eyes. Boone raised an eyebrow. That what people say about me, they will, Mathers said. Then his voice dropped low, cold as riverstone. Let me save you some time. There's no gold here, cowboy. Best keep riding. Boone studied him for a moment. Behind the sheriff's eyes was something dark. Not fear, exactly, but close. Like a man trying to hold a door shut against the past. Funny, Boone said. I didn't say anything about gold. The saloon went dead quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sheriff Mathers stiffened. Then he leaned in close. So, only Boone could hear. A long time ago, men came looking for treasure in Devil's Tooth Ridge. They dug, they bled, they died. Then more came. Same story. Now you seem like a man who wants answers. But trust me, what's buried out there ought to stay buried. Boone didn't flinch. You sayin' it's cursed. I'm sayin' it's poison. And poison don't care who swallows it. The sheriff straightened, tipped his hat, and turned to leave. Boone called after him. What happened to the last man who went looking? Mathers paused in the doorway. He never came back. And then he was gone. Boone turned back to his drink. The room slowly exhaled, but the tension lingered like smoke in the rafters. He reached into his coat, feeling the soft crackle of aged paper. The map was still there, marked with strange lines and a red X in the canyons north of town. The same place his brother Eli had last written about, years ago. Before vanishing like dust in the wind, Boone downed his whiskey and stood. He hadn't come for gold. He came for the truth. Asterisk, Boone didn't sleep much that night. He rented a room, above the saloon, small, creaky, and stinking of mold and bad choices, but his eyes never left the map. He unfolded it on the desk, smoothing the yellowed parchment under his palm. The ink was faded, the symbols strange, but the X was still clear, tucked into a gulch past Devil's Tooth Ridge, a note scribbled in the corner in a familiar hand. Found something. Boone, it's real. Meet me in Dead Mesa. Eli, that was 3 years ago. Boone hadn't seen his brother since at dawn. He saddled whiskey and rode out toward the edge of town, needing air and answers. Just outside the general store, he spotted a man with a thin frame and sharp features sitting on a crate, playing with a deck of cards. He looked up as Boone approached, a sly grin forming beneath a patchy beard. You look like a man who don't play poker, but keeps a gambler's secrets. Boone eyed him. You know the Ridge? The man smirked and tapped his deck. More than most. Name's Jasper Quill. Folks here call me a drunk and a liar. They're wrong on both counts. I don't drink. Boone leaned against the post. What do you know? Jasper's grin faltered. He motioned Boone closer, lowering his voice. You're not the first to come asking about Devil's Tooth. That ridge has taken more men than smallpox and war put together. Some say it's cursed. Others say there's gold buried so deep the earth screams to keep it hidden. Boone watched his eyes. Which do you believe? I believe the ones who went looking don't come back, Jasper said, and I believe the sheriff is sitting on something foul. Man's been walking crooked since the war ended, but Devil's Tooth, that's where he really got bent. Boone pulled the map halfway from his coat, enough for Jasper to glimpse the markings. Jasper whistled low. Well, damn me twice. That's the old Ramirez vein. Thought it was a myth. What vein? Back in '52, Spanish miners struck a line of gold deep under that ridge. Didn't last long. Earthquakes, landslides, ambushes, the ground swallowed the mine and most of the men with it. Only survivor went mad. Started drawing maps and talking about bones under gold. Boone narrowed his eyes. You ever hear of Eli Wilder? Jasper paused. Name rings. Tall kid. Rode through a few years back, real quiet. Asked a lot of the same questions you are now, then he just disappeared. Boone clenched his jaw. The sheriff, say anything. He told us Eli rode out west, but I saw the sheriff ride up the ridge that night. Came back alone, horse bleeding from the flanks. Wouldn't speak for a week. The silence between them stretched long. The only sound was the wind rustling the blackjack trees. Boone spoke low. What else do you know? Jasper shifted uncomfortably, fingers twitching. There's a cave up in the ridge. Locals call it the Hollow Mouth. Nobody goes near it, not even the sheriff's men. They say it groans at night, like something's still alive inside. If there's anything left of your brother, that's where you'll find it. Boone nodded, folding the map and tucking it back inside his coat. Jasper looked up at him one last time. You go up there, cowboy, you might find gold. You might even find your brother, but don't count on coming back with both. Boone gave him a nod and turned to go, but paused. If I don't come back, burn this town down. Jasper chuckled. You ain't the first man to say that. Boone mounted whiskey and rode out slow, the morning sun spilling across the canyon. He didn't look back. The wind picked up behind him, dry and high-pitched, like it was warning him away from the ridge. But Boone Wilder wasn't a man who turned back. He'd lost a brother, maybe more. And somewhere in that cursed ridge, something was waiting, buried beneath lies, gold, and blood. Dead Mesa was a town that knew how to keep quiet, but some silences get too loud to ignore. Boone had been riding the outskirts, studying the terrain and comparing it to the old map, when he felt eyes on him, not the kind that watched with curiosity, but the kind that measured distance to a trigger. He returned to town late in the afternoon, dirt caked on his boots and sunburning the back of his neck, as he tied whiskey at the hitching post outside the saloon. The doors to the sheriff's office swung open. Sheriff Clay Mathers stood there like a buzzard on a grave. Arms crossed, eyes cold. You ride out near the ridge today? He asked. No pleasantries. Boone didn't look at him right away. Just stretching my legs. Mathers stepped down onto the street, boots kicking up little puffs of red dust. Don't insult my intelligence. Wilder, you're pokin' your nose where it don't belong. Boone turned, slow. That right. Ridge is dangerous. I've seen men fall through the ground like it was water. Caves collapse. Snakes thicker than your arm. You keep sniffing around, you'll end up another ghost with a name carved into some rock. Boone studied him for a beat. You seem awful interested in where I spend my time, Sheriff. The two men locked eyes. The wind cut through town like a blade, kicking tumbleweeds down the main street. You listening at all? Mathers growled. There ain't no. Gold. Boone's voice was quiet, steady. Then why does it sound like you're guarding something? The sheriff's mouth twitched, just a flicker, but Boone caught it. He'd seen the same look on gamblers in saloons, just before they folded a bad hand. I'm guarding this town, Mathers snapped. From fools like you and the trouble you bring. You guarding it like you guarded my brother, Boone said, low and hard. The silence cracked like a whip. The air shifted. For a second, even the dust seemed to stop moving. Mathers took a slow step forward, his voice low now, like thunder rolling in. You don't know what you're talking about. Boone didn't back down. He came through here, asking questions, looking for the same ridge. Then he disappeared. Then he left. The sheriff replied flatly, rode west. Plenty of men do. Boone's hand twitched near his coat, not for his gun, but for the folded map tucked inside. I think you... No, that's not true. Mathers' jaw tightened. I don't have time for your ghost stories, Welder. I've buried better men than you for less. Boone didn't flinch. That a threat, Sheriff? Mathers stepped in close. Close enough Boone could smell the stale whiskey on his breath. It's a promise. He turned and walked away without another word. Boone watched him go, the tin star on his chest catching the sun for a moment before vanishing into shadow. That night, Boone sat alone in the saloon, nursing a glass and watching the door. The bartender had long since stopped trying to make conversation. Folks stayed out of his way. That was fine. Boone preferred the quiet. But as the moon climbed high and the streets emptied, a figure slipped into the saloon. Small, wiry, quick dash, I dot it. Was Jasper Quill. He slid into the booth across from Boone and placed a small object on the table. A brass button. Dirt still caked in its grooves. Found this out by Hollowmouth Cave. He whispered, Army issue. He said your brother served, right? Boone picked it up, his throat tightening. It was the kind issued to cavalry scouts. Eli's unit. I also found something else, Jasper said, glancing around. Boot tracks. Deep ones. Heavy weren't there yesterday. Someone's been up there recently, someone guarding it. Boone's fingers curled around the button. Mathers. Jasper nodded once. He's got secrets buried in that ridge, he said. And he's ready to kill, to keep them there. Boone looked out the saloon window toward the sheriff's office, where a low oil lamp flickered behind the curtains. Then I reckon it's time I started digging. Dawn broke over the high desert in blood-colored light. Boone rode early, long before the town stirred. The only sound was Whiskey's hooves crunching over the gravel trail as they headed north, out toward the jagged silhouette of Devil's Tooth Ridge, a serrated mountain that looked like the earth itself had grown fangs. The map guided him, worn creases tracing his fingers like scars. He followed dry stream beds and wind-carved stone pillars, passing landmarks that matched the old ink. Dead Man's Tree, Split Skull Rock, and a dried-up creek bed once labeled Silver Snake Wash. As the sun climbed, so did Boone, into steep, narrow passes where vultures circled overhead and the air got thin enough to taste. The higher he climbed, the quieter it became, until even the wind seemed reluctant to speak. By mid-morning, he found the ridge. It was worse than he expected. The slope opened into a rocky shelf littered with the bones of forgotten men, old mining gear, collapsed scaffolding, broken picks and shovels, half swallowed by dirt and time. There were markers, 2 rough-hewn crosses, names barely legible on splintered wood. Boone dismounted slowly. He walked among the graves, dust swirling around his boots, eyes scanning each name. Then he found one. Eatview. The letters were burned into a slab of sun-bleached wood, crooked and rushed. There were no dates, no other words. Just 2 letters, barely holding on to the surface. Boone's breath caught in his throat. Eli Wilder. He knelt beside the marker, brushing away the dust, fingers trembling. The soil was disturbed, not recently, but not ancient either. Someone had tried to bury something here. He reached into the earth, pulling loose rocks and hardened clumps of sand. It wasn't deep, maybe 2 feet down. His fingers hit something. Hard metal. Boone froze. He pulled it free, a small silver locket, dulled with age and dirt. The clasp was broken, but the moment he turned it over, his breath left him. His mother's initials were engraved on the back. A.W. Abigail Wilder. She'd given it to Eli before he left for the war. Boone sat back on his heels, locket in hand, heart pounding. His brother had been here. This wasn't just some lost legend. This was a grave, maybe a real one, maybe a fake, maybe a warning. He opened the locket. Inside was a tiny photo, nearly faded to nothing. 2 boys sitting on a fence rail, grinning, their boots too big, and their lives just beginning. Boone wiped at his eyes with the back of his sleeve. The wind shifted. Behind him, loose gravel scattered. A rock tumbled down the slope. Boone stood, hand on his revolver, eyes scanning the ridge. Nothing, but he felt it. The presence, the kind of weight that only comes from being watched. Slowly, carefully, he tucked the locket into his coat and began making his way around the ridge, following a trail of weathered boot prints, not his own. They led him around the bend, into a narrow crevice where the rock walls closed in like teeth. At the end of the pass was something half hidden by brush, a cave opening, dark as a gun barrel. Jasper had called it the hollow mouth. It was real. Boone stood there, staring into the black throat of the mountain. The air leaking out of it was cold, unnatural. It smelled of earth, rust, and something else. Blood. His instincts screamed. Something happened here, something violent. The sheriff had lied. There was no question now. Boone lit a match and tossed it inside. It flared, hissed, and went out. But in that flash of orange light, Boone saw something scratched into the stone just inside the cave. E.W. Same initials. Same hand. Boone stared into the dark. His brother had been here. Maybe still was. He turned and headed back toward his horse. As he mounted up, he caught movement high on the ridge, a shadow disappearing over a rise. Too quick to be a hiker, too far to shoot. But whoever it was, they were watching him, and they didn't want him coming back. Boone gritted his teeth. Too bad, he was just getting started. Boone rode back toward Dead Mesa, with the locket heavy in his pocket and a fire crawling under his skin. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, up on that ridge. That whoever had watched him disappear into the cave was still nearby, hidden in the rocks, maybe aiming down a rifle barrel. He took a longer route home, off the main trail, cutting through dry arroyos and jagged gullies. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that moved like ghosts across the desert floor. By the time he was halfway back to town, twilight had swallowed the sky. The wind picked up. Coyotes cried somewhere in the distance. And then Boone heard something else. A whisper. No, not a whisper. The snap of a twig. His eyes narrowed. He slowed Whiskey to a crawl and let his hand drift to the revolver on his hip. That's when it happened. A shot cracked through the air, sharp and close. Boone yanked the reins. Whiskey screamed and reared as a bullet tore through the dirt near Boone's stirrup. Another shot, this one grazed the brim of his hat. Boone dove off the saddle just as 3 riders burst from the brush. Rifles drawn, bandanas covering their faces. Ambush. He rolled behind a rock outcropping as bullets sparked off stone around him. Whiskey bolted down the canyon, riderless and terrified. Boone drew his Colt and returned fire. Fast and tight, one shot clipped a rider in the shoulder, spinning him off his horse. The other 2 circled wide, flanking. Boone cursed and sprinted through the gully, sliding down a steep slope into a dry wash as more gunfire echoed behind him. He ducked behind a boulder, heart pounding, blood buzzing in his ears. Silence, then footsteps on gravel. Slow, careful, one of them was coming. Boone checked his revolver. 2 shots left. The footsteps stopped. Then a voice, rough and familiar, called out, "Ain't nothing up there worth dying for." Wilder. Boone froze. He knew that voice. Deputy Frank Tilson, Sheriff Mather's right-hand man. Boone stood slowly, guns still raised. "Tilson, that you..." A pause, then, "Turn around and ride out. Now, last chance." Boone's jaw tightened. "You trying to kill me, Frank? For what? A story, a grave." Another silence. Then the man stepped into view, bandana down, rifle in hand. It was Tilson, but he didn't look proud. He looked haunted. "You should have never come back." Tilson muttered, "You should have listened to the sheriff." Boone stepped forward, slowly. "What did you do to my brother?" Tilson's face twisted. "We didn't mean to look. Eli found the shaft. He was gonna tell someone he found what Clay buried up there." "What did Clay bury?" Tilson looked down. "Bodies and gold." Boone's blood turned to ice. Eli had been right. The map was real. The vein was real. And Sheriff Mathers had been hiding it and killing to keep it hidden. "Sheriff's been pulling gold out of Devil's Tooth for years," Tilson said, voice shaking. "Only tells his own men. Keeps the town poor. Keeps the truth buried." "And my brother?" Boone demanded. Tilson swallowed hard. Tried to stop him. Didn't end well. A beat passed, then Boone fired. The bullet struck Tilson in the shoulder. He cried out and dropped his rifle, falling to his knees in the dust. "I don't shoot to kill unless I mean it," Boone said, walking forward, revolver still aimed. "You're gonna help me finish this." Tilson clutched his wound, eyes wide. "You're making a mistake." "No," Boone said, grabbing the man by the collar. "You and the sheriff did." Boone tied Tilson to his own horse and rode into Dead Mesa under a moonlit sky. Blood on his hands and the truth burning behind his eyes. The town slept, but not for long, because come morning, Boone Wilder was going to drag the truth into the daylight and Clay Mathers was going to answer for everything. The jailhouse was dark and musty, lit by a single oil lamp that flickered like a dying heartbeat. Boone stood outside the cell, arms crossed, watching Deputy Tilson slumped against the bars with a blood-stained bandage on his shoulder. The rest of the town was still asleep. Only the buzz of cicadas and the slow creak of the windmill reminded Boone that time was still moving. "You gonna talk?" Boone asked, voice low. Tilson didn't answer. He just stared at the floor like it held the weight of God's judgment. Boone leaned forward. "My brother's dead because of you. I don't want excuses. I want the truth." Tilson slowly raised his eyes. There was no fire left in him, only regret. "I didn't shoot him," he muttered, "but I didn't stop it either." Boone's fists clenched. "It was the cave," Tilson said. "The hollow mouth. Eli went in, came out with a piece of gold the size of his hand. Said he was going to tell the marshal in Dry Creek. Said it belonged to the people. That's when Mathers snapped. He killed him." Boone asked. Tilson nodded. Cave was deeper than it looked. A shaft that went down near 80 feet. Sheriff waited until Eli was inside and blew the entrance, buried him alive. Boone went still. His brother hadn't vanished. He'd been entombed, like a secret, like a sin. He carved his name into the rock. Tilson whispered before it collapsed. "I saw it myself. You want to know the truth, Wilder? Go to the cave. Bring a lantern and bring your nerve." By sunrise, Boone was back at Devil's Tooth Ridge. He tied Whiskey beneath a rock shelf and climbed to the cave entrance, where the ground still held the blast scars. Rubble was piled high, but Boone spotted a narrow crack in the rock wall, a crawl space just wide enough to squeeze through. He lit a lantern, took a breath, and entered the dark. Inside, the air was thick and cold, heavy with silence and something deeper, the sense that time itself had stopped. Boone crawled through the narrow shaft until the passage opened into a hollow chamber, its walls damp and slick. He held the lantern high, and then he saw it, names, carved into the walls. One after another, faint, ragged letters scratched into the stone by shaking hands. Names of men lost to greed. Men who never made it out. And there, at eye level, were 2 letters. E.W. Below, it barely legible, a final line, "Clay killed me." Boone stood there in the cold dark, staring at his brother's final words. The lantern flickered. His throat tightened. He reached out, fingers brushing over the carved message. Not just a confession, a cry, a final act of defiance from a man buried under the weight of someone else's lie. The truth was here, scratched into the bones of the earth. Boone stepped back and lowered the lantern. There was no more doubt. "Sheriff, Clay Mathers was a murderer, and the whole town had lived under the shadow of that lie. Boone emerged from the cave at dusk, face streaked with dust and grief. He held the lantern in one hand and his brother's locket in the other. He stood at the edge of the ridge, looking down at the town of Dead Mesa, now glowing with lanterns and firelight as it settled in for another quiet night, unaware that the peace they'd known was built on a grave. Boone didn't mount his horse right away. He stood there a long while, the wind tugging at his coat, whispering through the brush. Then he said it aloud, not to anyone living, but to the silence around him. "I found you." Eli clenched the locket in his fist. "I'm gonna finish what you started." And then, he turned his back on the cave, on the ridge, and rode down to Wardtown. There would be no hiding come morning, no more whispers. The sheriff's day of reckoning was near. The morning sun rose harsh and unyielding over Dead Mesa, casting long, sharp shadows across the cracked wooden sidewalks and the dusty street. Boone Welder rode slowly into town, Whiskey's hooves stirring clouds of red dust that danced in the pale light. His face was a hard line of determination, eyes narrowed against the glare, jaw set like iron. He carried the weight of more than just the locket in his coat pocket. He carried the burden of truth, vengeance, and years of unanswered questions. Dead Mesa was waking up, but the usual hum of the town was replaced by an uneasy stillness. Word had spread faster than Boone expected, and that meant Sheriff Clay Mathers was ready. Boone spotted the sheriff standing on the steps of the weather-beaten jailhouse, his figure thin but imposing beneath his worn hat. Clay's eyes locked on Boone's as he dismounted, a cold smile twisting his mouth. The townsfolk began to gather cautiously along the street, wary eyes peeking from behind curtains and around corners. Faces weathered and worn like the land itself. Miners, ranchers, old-timers, and drifters alike sensed the brewing storm. They knew the sheriff's reputation. And now Boone's return stirred something raw and dangerous. Boone stepped forward, voice steady and loud enough to carry through the morning air. "Sheriff Mathers, I know what you did. I've got proof. Eli didn't just vanish. You buried him alive to keep the gold for yourself." Mathers let out a bitter, hollow laugh that echoed off the cracked buildings. "You got nothing but a ghost story. Wilder names carved in rock and dreams of treasure. That's all you've got." Boone's hand hovered near his revolver but stayed still. "I've got your deputy too," Boone said, nodding toward the jailhouse where Frank Tilson was held. "He's ready to tell the town the whole truth." For a moment, Mathers' mask slipped, his smile vanished, replaced by a dangerous gleam. "You think this town will turn on me? I'm the law here, Wilder. Dead Mesa's mine to run." Boone met his gaze without flinching. "A lawman who kills to keep gold for himself isn't law at all. He's a killer and a thief." Clay's eyes darkened. Without warning, he drew his revolver and fired the crack of the shot, slicing the tense silence like a knife. Boone dove behind a water trough as bullets kicked up dirt and splintered wood around him. The street erupted in chaos. Townsfolk scattering, some reaching for rifles, others ducking behind barrels and wagons. Boone fired back, calm and precise, a shot ringing out and hitting Mathers' arm. The sheriff stumbled, a sharp cry escaping his lips as he dropped his weapon. From the shadowed alley, Jasper Quill appeared, rifle steady in his hands. "You're not alone, Boone," he shouted, backing him up. Mathers cursed and fired wildly, desperation fueling his shots. Bullets thudded into wooden posts and kicked up dust near the gathered crowd, some of whom had now armed themselves and moved closer. Boone seized the moment, charging forward with resolve hard as steel. He tackled Mathers near the hitching post, wresting the revolver free and slamming the sheriff onto the wooden planks. Mathers fought like a cornered beast, wild, clawing, spitting curses, but Boone's grip was unyielding. "Tell the truth," Boone hissed, pressing his knee into the sheriff's chest. "Tell the town what you did to my brother." Clay's face contorted in fury and pain. Then, slowly, the fight drained out of him. His voice was low and cracked when he spoke. "The gold, it wasn't just mine. It was for the town's safety, to keep outsiders from tearing it apart. I did what I had to do." Boone's eyes burned. "By murdering Eli Wilder. You buried him alive in that cave." Mathers said nothing. The crowd had closed in, faces grim and silent. The weight of the sheriff's words and silence pressed down on them all. Deputy Tilson stepped forward, leaning on his crutch, voice trembling but firm. "The sheriff's been stealing from us for years, hiding gold and booties in that ridge. I helped him cover it up, and it's a burden I can't bear no more." Murmurs spread through the crowd, anger, shock, relief. Boone looked out over the faces of the people of Dead Mesa. The place had been more than a town. It had been a prison built of lies. He sheathed his revolver, voice clear and strong. "You all deserve better, and so did Eli." Clay Mathers was handcuffed and hauled to the jailhouse. His reign ended not with glory, but dust and disgrace. Boone stood tall in the middle of the street, the locket warm in his pocket, a symbol of family lost and justice finally found. Dead Mesa was broken. But maybe, just maybe, it could start to heal. The town of Dead Mesa was quieter now. The dust had settled. but the weight of what had been unearthed still hung heavy in the air. Sheriff Clay Mathers sat behind bars, his head bowed, the gleam of gold bars and coins spilling from a burlap sack laid out in the jailhouse. The stolen fortune, the cursed gold of Devil's Tooth Ridge, was finally exposed. The men and women of Dead Mesa gathered around, eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and a long-buried hope. Boone Wilder stood beside the pile, his fingers brushing over the glittering metal. The locket in his pocket felt heavier than ever, a reminder of the brother he'd found too late and the promise he had made to him. Jasper Quill, now a trusted ally, leaned in. That gold's worth a fortune. Boone could rebuild this town, even bring in new folks. Boone nodded slowly. It's more than just gold. It's what Mathers tried to bury. Greed, lies, blood. The town's mayor, an elderly woman named Martha Ellis, spoke up. What happens now? Who decides? Boone met her gaze, then looked around at the faces of the townsfolk, men and women who had lived in fear or suspicion for too long. This town needs a new sheriff, Boone said, voice steady. One who answers to the people, not a pocket full of gold. A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. Boone's eyes drifted to the ridge beyond town, where the sun was setting behind Devil's Tooth, painting the sky in fiery reds and oranges. He thought of Eli, his laughter, his courage, the sacrifice he'd made. Boone finally spoke, voice low and honest. I didn't come back for gold. I came back for the truth. For my brother. He pulled the silver locket from his pocket and held it up. This is for Eli, for anyone who's been buried by lies. Martha smiled softly. You're one of us now, Boone Wilder. The next weeks were filled with hard work and rebuilding. The gold was used to repair the church, fix the wells, and bring in new supplies. The town slowly started to breathe again. Boone stayed, becoming the sheriff Dead Mesa needed, firm but fair, carrying the weight of justice on his shoulders. At night, he'd sit outside the sheriff's office, whiskey by his side, staring up at the stars. Sometimes, he spoke aloud, as if Eli were there. Rest easy, brother. I'm taking care of things now. Dead Mesa was no longer a town shadowed by fear and greed. It was a place of new beginnings, and Boone Wilder, once a wandering cowboy, found something he never expected: home.